Good evening and welcome to St. John's College. Tonight it is my pleasure to welcome Dr. Thornton Lockwood to the college. Professor Lockwood is an alum of our Graduate Institute and later received his PhD in philosophy from Boston University. He is currently in the philosophy department at Quinnipiac University with a joint appointment in environmental studies. He's the author of numerous articles and book chapters on Aristotle's ethics and politics, among other things, and has lately turned his attention to the connections between politics and nature. His lecture tonight is entitled On Aristotle's Politics, Nature, Justice, and Constitutions. Please join me in welcoming Professor Lockwood to St. John's College.
Thank you very much for that warm welcome. Give me 30 seconds while I array all of my devices. So I hope that everyone has a handout because I will be drawing upon that, and to some extent that will be my narrative text, which I will be using really throughout the whole lecture this evening. So let me begin by saying what an extraordinary honor it is as a graduate of St. John's College to be invited back to speak at a Friday night lecture. When I was at the Graduate Institute, attending the Friday night lectures was really one of the great joys of my time here. So I know how privileged I am to be welcomed back and to have an opportunity to talk to you about a book that I've spent a little bit of time with and have tried to understand in some of its detail. I want to thank the Dean for the introduction, but also for the invitation to come and for making my trip very, very smooth and welcoming. I especially want to thank Mr. Bell and Mr. Schulman, who last night invited me to attend their freshman seminar, which is also reading the politics, and in many respects gave me the narrative unity that I hope to present to you tonight, so that I'm not just speaking about text, but something broader from that. So in terms of format, I want to read something to situate what I'm going to say, but then the remainder of the lecture is really to look at individual passages and try to get a sense of how they inform the thesis that I want to advance about how we should understand Aristotle's politics. So let me begin. In his Pensées, Blaise Pascal wrote, "If Plato and Aristotle wrote about politics, it was as if to lay down rules for a madhouse. And if they pretended to treat it as something really important, it was because they knew that the madmen they were talking to believed themselves to be kings and emperors. They humored those beliefs in order to calm down their madness with as little harm as possible." 1670, paragraph 331. So what I'd like to suggest is that although I think Pascal is right about Plato, whether we're thinking of the discussion of the cave, whether we're thinking about the discussion of the compulsion to rule, whether we think about the way that Plato seems to think of ruling as indiscriminately the same thing, whether we're talking about despotic ruling or we're talking about household rule or we're talking about political rule, I dare to say I think Pascal is wrong about Aristotle. I think that Aristotle not only rejuvenates the notion of what we would think of as the politikos bios, or the political life in the politics, which he does explicitly in Book 7, he organizes the politics around its epistemic exemplar, namely the politikos, a politikos who possesses politicae. Now, these are all terms that I hope to explicate a little bit further in my lecture, but I take it, and the thesis that I want to advance is that although Aristotle is well aware of the madhouse quality of politics, he's very, very well aware of faction, disagreement, and strife. Nonetheless, he believes that there is knowledge of political things, and that knowledge can alleviate and even make beneficial political communities. Politics is not hopeless. To support such a thesis, I would like to look at four points that show why Aristotle's politikos does more than simply lay down rules for a madhouse. Politicae is an epistemically rich and beneficial domain of science. So the 4 parts that I'm going to look at. First, I'd like to argue that Aristotle's epistemic disagreement with someone whom I'm going to call Platonic Socratic science, more on that in a second, makes clear that there is a profound gap in the understanding of politics between Plato and Aristotle. So secondly, I'd like to show you how Aristotle's polis physae, the city by nature, makes clear that this Platonic Socratic science of ruling is false. This will focus primarily on understanding what does Aristotle mean by this term physis, or in the data, the physae. Thirdly, I will argue that the very differentiation of just constitutions, distinguished from unjust or deviant constitutions, is an expression of what we mean by these terms politicae, politikos, and so forth. And lastly, I'd like to look at what it is the politikos knows. There's an extended passage in the 4th book of the Politics where we get an account of what it is that this person who possesses politicae understands, and it is primarily about different forms of constitutions. So that will give me a chance to try to flesh out the claim that ruling a city is way, way more than just a bunch of rules for a madhouse. So enough of my prepared remarks. What I'd like to do now is to walk you through the handout that you have and use it to try to illustrate and if you like, put flesh on these bones that I've presented to you. So you can see that the first page of the handout, which I call an introduction, it introduces you to a couple of passages that try to make sense of these different polit cognates. The main ones that I'm going to focus on are politicae, which usually means something like politicae episteme or politicae techne. I simply will call this politics, and the politikos, who, again, I will simply call a politician, realizing that term has somewhat different nuance today. So I do believe one should always start with the opening lines of a book and even read them aloud. So let me begin there. The opening words of the Politics are as follows. Since we see every city to be a sort of community, and every community to be formed for the sake of some good, for everyone does every action for the sake of what seems to be good. Clearly then, while every community aims at some good, the community that has the most control of all and encompasses all the others aims both at the good that has the most control of all and does so to the highest degree. And this community is the one called a city, the community that is political. He koinonia, he politicae. So in terms of making sense of the politicae and the politikos, this passage, I take it, is articulating the object which it is that the politikos understands. And although I won't read it verbatim, you can see that the second passage, which comes from the Nicomachean Ethics, fleshes out further the claim that both the Nicomachean Ethics and the Politics are quote-unquote political by this nature. This is to say that political science, on the one hand, is trying to understand what is good for the city. But more than that, Aristotle characterizes political science as quote-unquote a architectonic science. So this is a relatively precise epistemic claim. It is to say that it is a kind of integrative or meta-knowledge about other forms of knowledge. So I will read one little passage from T2. For instance, about halfway down the first paragraph, Aristotle writes, we see that even the capacities that are generally more honored are under politicae. For example, generalship, household management, and rhetoric. And since it uses the other practical sciences and furthermore legislates about what must be done and what avoided, its end will circumscribe those of the others so that it will be the human good. So I reiterate, political science here is not just a master science in the sense that it is thinking about what is good for a political community. It understands and is able to integrate, to evaluate, to command, to legislate other forms of knowledge. Now, immediately after articulating political science in such a fashion, Aristotle, in the first chapter of the Politics, introduces his stalking horse, the individual who he seems to be arguing with for almost all of the first book of the Politics. I'm going to call this the Socratic, Platonic, unitary science of ruling. I'll probably just say the science of ruling. Here's how Aristotle describes it. Now, those who think the positions of politician, king, household manager, and master are the same are not correct. For they think that each of these differs with regard to large or small numbers, but not in kind. For example, if someone rules few people, he is a master, more, a household manager. If still more, he has the position of politician or king. So, if you like, the first question that I want to put to you as an audience, but also to myself for this paper, how is it that Aristotle's understanding of political science is in tension with this so-called Socratic science of ruling? I say so-called Socratic science of ruling. This is something that we find articulated in Plato's Statesman. We find it articulated in Xenophon's Memorabilia. We find it articulated in Xenophon's Economicus. And what he seems to have in mind is a science or an understanding of negative and positive incentives. There's a passage, for instance, in the Oikonomicus where the character Ischomachus talks about incentivizing, or if you like, punishing and rewarding slaves. And the claim is that what a slave master does to get slaves to follow the commands and order is really no different than what a king does or a politician does. Now, notice the contrast with political science, with politicae. Whereas a unitary science of ruling claims that if I'm ruling a household, if I'm ruling a city, if I am ruling a slave, I'm using the same knowledge for all of those. There's no differentiation with respect to the epistemic status. By contrast, Aristotle's claim is that there is a form of knowledge which, by definition, is integrative of different forms of knowledge. All of the things that the Socratic science claims are a single, if you like, homogeneous, unitary science, Aristotelian political science is saying it is the exact opposite. Instead, we have heterogeneous ways of knowing. To know how to give guidance to a is different. To know how to give guidance to a spouse is different than to know how, for instance, to give guidance to a slave. So I reiterate, whereas Pascal starts us off by saying Plato and Aristotle rule cities like one would rule the insane asylum. I don't think that can be the case for what Aristotle has in mind, because what he's thinking of is something that says we need a different form of knowledge given the object of, and again, the word is going to be rule, it's going to be arche, but I think of it more in terms of guiding, incentivizing, giving direction, again, rather than arche as some kind of firm ruling. So I reiterate, first page of the text, I take it that this is what matters to Aristotle and that he's really clear in his intentions, that the argument that he is making is directed exactly at this Platonic, Socratic, unitary science of ruling. So I next want to consider one of the more complicated texts in the Politics. This is Politics 1:2, where Aristotle makes the claim that the polis exists by nature. Now, within my community of Aristotle scholars, this is a very, very, fruitful place for writing. There are articles and articles and books and books and books trying to figure out what did Aristotle mean by his claim that the city is, quote unquote, by nature. Now, what matters for the interpretation that I'm offering you and saying that Aristotle is in dialogue with a very, very specific position is a passage that I feel is neglected often when we look at this question of the city by nature. And this is T4 on my handout. This passage T4 is continuous with T3. So in other words, yes, there's a break in my page, but there's no break in the text as a whole. So in other words, again, just so we're on the same page, at T3 it ends with Aristotle saying these claims are not true, namely the claims that we find in Plato and in Xenophon. And then immediately thereafter we have what I am saying, my to legomenon. That will be clear if we investigate the matter in accord with the methodological inquiry that has guided us elsewhere. For as in other cases, a composite must be analyzed until we reach things that are incomposite. Since these are the smallest parts of the whole, so too it is by investigating the parts of which a city is composed that we can see better both, and I'm going to underscore this, how these parts differ from each other, and whether or not it is possible to gain some craft-like expertise concerning each of the things we have mentioned. Now, anyone who's spent some time with the first book of the Politics immediately will recognize that although we have this city by nature introduced in Politics 1-2, the majority of Politics 1 is concerned with the household. So we get we get an account of, if you like, money-making, chromatistike. We get an account of the relationship between a master and a slave. We get an account between a husband and a spouse. We have an account of children and so forth. So often it's thought the Politics, well, this is Aristotle starting with non-political stuff. So he's going to talk about the non-political household before, in Politics 3, he's going to start talking about constitutions and citizens and so forth. Another way of reading the passage is to say that what's really going on in the Politics is that Aristotle is articulating the basic theorems of his political thought. So Politics 1-2, you'll remember, not only says that the city exists by nature, but that humans are political animals more than any other animals. And that further, the polis is prior to any of its citizens. And there's a long strand of scholarships that says, oh, what Aristotle's doing here, he's basically introducing the basic theorems of his political philosophy. That the city exists by nature is Aristotle's claim, and we can contrast that with the sort of thing that one might find in a Hobbes or a Locke or a Rousseau. So, if you'd like, let me read the passage and suggest to you one way this passage is sometimes read by scholars. So T5 is far too long for me to read aloud, but I'm going to focus on the second and third sentences there. It, the polis, comes to be for the sake of living, but it exists for the sake of living well. That is why every city exists by nature, if indeed the first communities also do. For this community is their end, and nature is an end. For what each thing is, when its coming to be has been completed, this we say is the nature of each. For example, of a human being, of a horse, or of a household. Further, it's for the sake of which its end is best, and self-sufficiency is both end and best. So those of you who remember your freshman Greek, or who have kept it going, you can see on the right-hand side, this is a mishmash of all Aristotelian technical terms. We've got phusis, we've got the huhenika, we've got the telos. And we have the claim that the city, the polis phusei, the city exists by nature. Now, when we try to understand this claim, prominent, for instance, is what we see in T6. The notion that when Aristotle claims that the city exists by nature, he must have in mind something like Book 2, Chapter 1 of the Physics, in which we get the claim that things that exist by nature are substances that have an internal principle of motion, principle and rest. And Physics 2.1 is really, really explicit. The things that have a nature are primarily living beings. It includes natural elements because, again, fire, water, air, and so forth, they have inherent principles of motion. But he's primarily thinking of animate beings, cats, dogs, fishes, plants. And to say that they exist by nature is just to say that they are capable of progressing towards their own end, their own telos. Now, as soon as you start to envision the polis fusei along this model, immediately you're struck with the question, well, is the polis a living being? Is the polis a substance? Is the polis something that we should understand as like a living being? There are passages where Aristotle will ascribe to the polis a bios and talk about the bios of a polis can be the same as the bios for a human being. And by bios, of course, we mean a kind of life. Now, the problem with that claim, and there's a number of problems with it, but first and foremost is that it seems that Aristotle thinks of substances as, although composed of parts, substances are not superorganisms. Polises are not, or let me restate, a substance can't be composed of substances. But further, if we start to think of the polis as something that exists by nature or that has its own principle of change and rest, you can see that immediately in T7, we run into a problem because although Aristotle recognizes that humans have a kind of impulse, a horme or a desire or an urge to community, the person who first put one together was also the cause of very great goods. So it looks like polises do not emerge naturally like natural organisms. Humans beget humans, dogs beget dogs, excuse me. Polises do not beget polises. Now, I reiterate, in the field of Aristotle studies, there's about 40 years of scholarship that have struggled with how do you reconcile T5, T6, and T7. What I'd like to suggest to you, and again, this is partially an interpretive move, but it's partially a question that I would like you to think about. If we know that Aristotle is interested in distinguishing his own position from the Socratic unitary science of ruling, and we have T4 that says explicitly, to make clear why the Platonic position is wrong, we need to look at wholes differentiated into parts. Well, then why would Aristotle introduce the city by nature as a piece of an argument against the Socratic unitary science? I believe the crucial point is how we understand this word phusis in T5. So you can see that when the paragraph that I'm reading, when Aristotle talks about phusis here, he's identifying it primarily with the word telos, the word end, or the tohu henika. And notice he gives an example, not just a polis, but a human being, a horse, and a household. And again, by household, okia, it could include components like, say, for instance, animals, property, but it's primarily the household farm with all of its constituents. So what I'd like to argue is that when he's thinking of saying that the polis exists by nature, he's not interested, if you like, in the principle of motion that brings the polis into existence. I don't think that that is his primary focus. I think rather what he's interested in is the notion that the teleology of a polis, the end or the purpose of a polis, lets us know its final cause, rather than, if you like, the agent cause or the thing that is responsible for creating the polis. I think that if we think of a polis as one specific kind of entity that has a telos, then all of a sudden we can see that that entity has parts that also have their own tele. So I reiterate, it's not just that the polis has a telos. The household, which is a component of the polis, it also has a telos. My question to you is, how would that serve as a premise in an argument against the claim that Socratic unitary science is false. So again, I hope my claim is clear. How exactly to make that argument is something that I'd really be interested to hear how you would understand if I'm right to say that Aristotle is redirecting the Socratic unitary science, and that's exactly what he has on his mind when he's talking about the city by nature. So let me switch gears to my third piece, or third point of my lecture this evening. So remember that I said that when we think of these various iterations of politics, so politicae I'm thinking of as a branch of knowledge. It's a kind of episteme. It's a kind of expertise. The politikos is the specific person that possesses that kind of science. But Aristotle in his Politics often recognizes and seems to identify a form of arche, or of rule. So political rule we could think of as distinct from despotic rule, from household rule. It is precisely the form of guiding and commanding that takes place between citizens. So if you like, politicae in this instance is less about the polis and more about the polites, or the citizen thereof. So I reiterate, if Book 1 of the Politics is really, really interested in defending a notion of political science against a Platonic or a Socratic notion of scientific rule. So what I think we find when we get to Book 3 of the Politics is a different focus on the politikos and the politicae. What we find in Book 3 of the Politics, rather than the epistemic claim about how we could integrate different kinds of knowledge, instead we are focused on politicae as a form of ruling. So in the third book of the Politics, Aristotle introduces another very important concept within his work. This is the so-called politeia. Yes, when we're reading Plato, we call that a republic. But for Aristotle, as he defines it in T8, a politeia is, at least in this specific context, is the organization of the various offices of the power of a political community. It certainly could be written down, but by no means are we presupposing some kind of written constitution. We could talk about, for instance, in the framework of Athenian history, Solon's constitution, or we could talk about the Cleisthenic constitution, or we could talk about the Periclean constitution. And what we have in mind is how the assembly, or the council, or the Areopagus, how their composition changes over time. But again, it's not a constitution in any kind of written sense that we would recognize as the US Constitution. So especially the first-year students who have just been reading in Book 3 are familiar with the taxonomy. We have correct constitutions, we have deviant constitutions, we have monarchy, we have royal kingship, we have aristocracy, and we have polity. Deviant constitutions, we have tyranny, we have oligarchy, and we have democracy. Now, what I find more striking than the familiar taxonomy is the basis for establishing that taxonomy. And this is why I want to focus your attention especially on texts T9 and T10. Let me read aloud T9 first. A human being is by nature a political animal. That is why, even when they do not need each other's assistance, people desire no less to live together. Nonetheless, it is also true that the common advantage brings them together to the extent that some share of noble living falls to each. It is especially this, then, that is the end, namely the telos, both of all community and of each separately. Let me put one more text on the table, and then I'll go back and say a little bit more about T9 and T10. So this is just a few lines after T9. the first part of the text. Despotic rule, although in truth the same thing is advantageous for what is by nature a master and what is by nature a slave, is nonetheless rule exercised with a view to the master's own advantage, though coincidentally with a view to that of the slave. Ellipsis. On the other hand, rule over children, wife, and the household generally, which we, for that reason, call household management, is either for the sake of the ruled or for the sake of something common to both ruled and ruler. So we have two different concepts here. One of them is the so-called common advantage, the cone sum feron. The other is this distinction between rule that is advantageous to oneself and rule that is advantageous to the person who is being ruled. So, of course, this is the basis for our distinction between right and deviant constitutions. But note further, and this is, for instance, like we find at the very, very end of T11, the correct constitutions are like, deviant constitutions are like the rule of a master, whereas a city is a community of free people. Now, I take it what Aristotle has in mind here is this second notion of politiké. I reiterate, in the part one, I was thinking primarily of politiké as a kind of episteme that allows us to understand the different tile of different parts or communities within a polis. But what seems to be at issue here is politiké arche, namely the form of guiding, of leading, of ruling that exists between free and equal citizens. And notice that packed into the taxonomy, this distinction between right and deviant constitutions, if you like, is nothing other than what it is that politiké arche provides us with. So politiké arche is rule that is concerned with the advantage of the person ruled. But that further, politiké arche is determined with the goal, with the telos, with the end of the person who is ruled. And that telos is nothing other than a share in the good life. So I reiterate my friend Pascal one more time. Imagine viewing politics solely as an expertise in how to control people, an expertise in how to minimize faction, expertise in how to bring some semblance of order to the chaos that is interpersonal relationships. I reiterate, I can think of numerous places in Plato where that seems to be at play. But here we have something very, very different. If you like, here we have the notion, admittedly, of a leader citizen, although I don't think exclusively a leader, but citizenship as something that benefits the community, benefits our fellow citizens, and at its very, very heart is what is sometimes called the craft analogy, this notion that ruling is a craft that exists and is just insofar as it benefits the object of rule. What would be the difference, if you like, between a sort of Socratic keeping the madhouse in order versus a kind of politikos exercising politiké either epistemically or in terms of ruling? Well, this is nothing other than the difference of, should I think of the world as one in which my political involvement and my political engagement is an intrinsically valuable and life-fulfilling activity? And again, especially in Mr. Bell and Mr. Schulzman's seminar, this came out several times with students who are struggling with the politics. Always in the back of a Johnny's mind is something like mathematics, metaphysics, natural science. The philosophical life is the place where one learns about these things and spends time with these things and communes with these truths. And within such a framework, how could the political life ever compare? How could the political life ever compare? And a number of the students in the seminar are like, Okay, I get that Aristotle says the political life is valuable, but is it? Not so much. Notice how Aristotle is repositioning the political life in the person of the politicos. So rather than thinking of keeping order and making sure that it's not mob rule, I am fundamentally concerned with the well-being of my fellow citizens, and my fellow citizens are concerned with my well-being. Citizenship within this model is one in which we actively engage with the political community. We actively interact with people who have control over us, who have authority over us, because we will also have authority and control over them. Again, that's packed into this notion of political rule. When Aristotle talks about justice in the Nicomachean Ethics, side note, there's a book I'm working on this project, so forgive me if I use an example from it. When Aristotle talks about justice in the Nicomachean Ethics, you'll remember he talks about this notion of justice in distribution or justice in allocation, and he talks about a kind of corrective justice. One of my claims I make in the book is that those responsibilities, those virtues seem to correspond very, very well with two different civic institutions we find in 5th and 4th century Greece, namely the assembly, where we are making decisions, we are passing decrees that honor people, and in the law courts, in which we make decisions about how to punish and correct and penalize people. And again, within a sort of democratic framework, to participate in the assembly or to participate in a law court, these are not duties in the sense of onerous responsibilities that we all wish we could get out of, which is somehow like we deal with jury service. This is rather an opportunity for one to exercise one's care about equality between fellow citizens. Again, my text is the politics, and this is what I'm focusing on. But when I understand Aristotle's claim about what is a citizen, and I see that he defines citizenship specifically in terms of judgment or being involved in judicial bodies and in assemblies, I think this is exactly where we have a connection between the 5th book of the Nicomachean Ethics and everything that we're getting about citizenship and politics in Aristotle's Politics. I reiterate, being a citizen is a way of achieving one's well-being. And that's nothing other than to say it's not something that we do to keep the madhouse running well. It's actually a way to have happiness and to have satisfaction. And I think that is really, really well attested, again, with understanding political rule as that which differentiates what is just and what is unjust from a social perspective. So one last piece of my argument. What is it that the politicos knows? So here I'm going to think of a slightly different text, the parts of animals. So in the parts of animal, this is book 1, chapter 5, Aristotle has a passage that if you like, encourages or protrepticizes or explains why natural science is really, really valuable. And famously, he quotes Heraclitus, who says, there are gods here too. Now, to a certain mindset that understands science primarily as transcendent beings, ideas, mathematics, the natural world is really, really messy, and it doesn't look like it's a realm in which we can have knowledge. And I reiterate, Parts of Animals 1.5 is the counterpoint to exactly that worldview. There is scientific knowledge of the life world. And when we look, for instance, at Aristotle's Historia Animalium, there is this fascination with how animals differ, how they interact with their habit, how they interact with other animals. It's really, really clear to me that what we think of, for instance, as zoology, is clearly a realm of science. And it's one with a rich notion of knowledge, and it's one in which a kind of contemplation arrives at satisfaction because it is knowledge. So I'd like to say that we find something very, very similar when we ask what it is that the politicos knows. I reiterate, in the beginning of Book 4 of the Politics, Aristotle tries to explain what is the nature of political science. Now, this passage I put before you in part because I think it helps us understand the epistemic range that the politicos possesses, but I think it's also a good passage to see what Aristotle scholars do for their day job, because it's not exactly clear how to make all of these passages line up. But let me introduce you to the passage first, and then show why this creates a little bit of difficulty and confusion for we Aristotle scholars. So Aristotle likens a political science to a kind of gymnastic trainer. And he's going to use an analogy that just like a gymnastic trainer exercises a certain kind of ascesis or a certain kind of training over the object of training, namely the athlete, so too does the political scientist exercise a certain, not exactly an ascesis, but a certain kind of ability to aid, to reform different forms of constitutions. I reiterate, start with the thing to which it is being compared, namely the gymnastics. This is T14. Among all the crafts and sciences that are not partly developed, but that, having become complete, deal with some one genus, it belongs to a single one to get a theoretical grasp on what is fitting in the case of each genus. For example, in the case of training, what sort is fit for what sort of body? And you can see there's numbers inserted here. We need to know, I'll add that, parenthetically, what sort is best, what one sort of training is fitting for most bodies, and skipping the parentheses, and further, if someone has an appetite neither for the physical state nor for the scientific knowledge appropriate for those involved in competition, it belongs no less to coaches and athletic trainers to provide this capacity too. So to state that less technically, if I am a coach, I need to be able to provide exercises, for instance, to a Division I college athlete, namely someone of extraordinary strength, talent, and ability. I need to be able to provide a training regimen for someone, again, Division I college athlete. But if I'm a trainer and I want to be able to offer general advice, no matter how healthy, no matter how athletic you are, it's always good to walk 1 hour a day. That's what he seems to have in mind when he talks about the kind of training that is fitting for most bodies. Last but not least, we have people who are not especially concerned with fitness, people who have not done much training, and people who don't really have any desire to improve their physical fitness. A coach needs to be able to give advice to such a person also. Now, Aristotle takes these three different tasks and says we need to do something analogous with respect to politics. So, again, T15 follows immediately after T14. Based on this analogy, it is clear that it belongs to the same science to get a theoretical grasp on what is the best constitution, and I'm skip down a little bit, what constitution is fitting for which cities. Number 3, the constitution based on a hypothesis. And 4, besides all these things, the science should know which constitution is most fitting for all cities. Now, you can see that I give you 3 other texts, T16, T17, and T18, but I'll cut to the chase, which is the last page of your handout. So on one level, the knowledge that the political scientists have is relatively straightforward and clear. It looks like there are a number of different things that the political scientist is going to know that are going to be a function of this person's expertise. Problem: how many tasks is the political scientist going to be able to do is described differently, and sometimes there's 3, and sometimes there's 4. And if you look at all 5 of these passages, they don't always line up. So immediately the question is, how do we make sense of these different accounts? To give you just one example from the passage at the very, very end. So think of the gymnastic training, the ascesis for most bodies. So you can see that's the second example of T13. And again, the example would be something like, no matter how old, no matter how young, no matter how athletic, everyone should walk for 60 minutes a day. So when we look at the other passages, and we ask, well, what is analogous to that? Like, what is analogous to walking an hour every day? Well, in the first articulation of the science of constitutions, we get the claim that which constitution is best fit for the underlying conditions of which city. So what we have here is a notion that there needs to be a fit between, if you like, the matter, the hule, the citizen body of a political community, and its political organization. It's not by coincidence. I think he is actually using a form of hylomorphism here, the notion that when we talk about unities, we can understand both the form and the matter of those unities. But notice the problem here. So if I say that everyone should exercise for an hour a day and just do some light walking, that example really, really looks to be what I would prescribe as a coach for everyone. But when we start to talk about which constitution is best fit for the underlying conditions of which cities, that's a very, very different notion. That is to say something like, if you look at 5th century Athens, especially, say, for instance, like after the Battle of Salamis, when all citizens are participating in the armed forces of Athens, are serving in the navy, are serving as rowers, are integral parts of the Athenian political architecture. You can't walk into Athens and say, oh, sure, let's have a monarchy. Oh, sure, let's have an oligarchy. The fit between the matter and the constitution would be deeply problematic. Again, much in the way, if you think of as the 30 at the end of the 5th century, following Athens' defeat by Sparta. So on one level, I reiterate, Aristotle is making an important claim that we'll find elsewhere in the Politics. There needs to be a close fit between the matter of a political community and its constitution, if you'd like, the hule and the form of it. But that's just to say that the constitution that is best for a certain kind of matter is not true for everyone else. It's just to say, for instance, that this second example that Aristotle uses in his analogy doesn't map onto the athletic example. So I reiterate, one of the things that I really struggle with and invite you to help me with, because I actually don't know how to put all of these together. When we have all of these examples of what political knowledge is like, on one level it looks really, really simple. You're like a trainer. As a trainer, you have different functions, and the way that you exercise that training expertise depends upon the nature of the athlete who you're training. That seems relatively straightforward. We can also say that it matters that the one form of training that is clear is this notion that as a political scientist, you need to think about what is the best constitution. Again, just like a trainer needs to imagine, oh, wow, I'm not just training a bunch of 6-year-olds. I'm going to be a coach or an athletic trainer for the University of Maryland basketball team. So like Aristotle is really, really clear that the science or the expertise that the politicos has includes the question of what is the very, very best organization of a society. And again, those of you in the freshman seminar, this was the reading that you prepared for this week. Books 7 and 8 of Aristotle's Politics is all concerned with this best constitution. So I reiterate, it's not that this is completely puzzling. You can say, like, well, clearly he's got different notions of expertise here, but how do they all gel together? And the place where I think this is most interesting is this category of what he calls the Constitution by hypothesis. Sorry. One last passage to read to you. Again, this is from T15. So the third form of expertise that the political scientist needs to master is to understand a constitution based on a hypothesis. For it must be able to study how any given constitution might come into existence from the start, and in what way, once in existence, it might be preserved for the longest time. I mean, for example, when some city happens to be governed neither by the best constitution, nor by the best one possible in the existing circumstances, but by a worse one. So what does Aristotle seem to have in mind here? So this is one point where I fear the students in freshman seminar are going to have to scratch their heads a little bit, because although you have read a good bit about the character of deviant constitutions, it's really in Book 5 of the Politics, which is not a substantial part of the reading, where Aristotle provides ways that we can preserve deviant constitutions. So again, I mean, when we think about the expertise of the politicos, and I do want to emphasize, there's a component of that expertise that is very, very much thinking about how do we exercise political rule that is aimed at the advantage of those in society with whom we're interacting. Notice that the statesman also needs to understand how to stabilize worse constitutions, aka deviant constitutions. And when we turn to Book 5 of the Politics, perhaps the longest account of how to preserve a constitution is a discussion of tyranny. In other words, we have a huge text, longer than any other chapter in Book 5, that explains how a political scientist can preserve and elongate a tyrannical constitution. And immediately the question must be, is that knowledge? Is that just? Is it right that the political scientist is giving expertise and guidance to a community that is exploiting its own people and that is explicitly designed for the exploitation that is beneficial for the tyrant? So I reiterate, there's ways in Aristotle's knowledge of the politicos. It's not that it's simple or unexpected, but when you hear that, well, you need to understand what is the best constitution, you need to understand how constitutions fit with their population, that seems straightforward. But the notion that a politicos should, in some sense, be an advisor to a tyrant, that's more complicated. Thank you very much.